Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in on Syriana Analysis. I know the new year is almost here and most of you are on vacation. However, there are developing issues happening in West Asia, especially in regards to the Iranian role in the region. Iran is nowadays accused by the United States and Israel of escalating in the region. They're accusing Iran of meddling in what's happening in the Gaza Strip. They're accusing Iran of bombing some of the cargo ships by drone attacks. And also one of the senior commanders of the Iranian forces were assassinated in Damascus only recently. And therefore, I wanted to host Dr. Mohammad Marandi from Tehran in order to get the perspective of Tehran on these issues, because Tehran and Iran is very important player in the region. And I think that we cannot exclude the point of view of Iran from a discussion that is dominated by the mainstream media, who are continuously, I would say, peddling the talking points of the United States. So thank you very much, Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, for being my guest again today on Syrian Analysis. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Actually, I wanted to speak with you about the Iranian role in the region overall. However, only recently, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared that one of its brigadier generals, Razi Mousavi, a top commander in the IRGC Quds Force, which means a former colleague of the commander of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, has been killed by an Israeli strike on Damascus near Sayyidah Zainab. I think the people want to know, what was the late Brigadier General doing in Damascus? What was his task, to bluntly speaking about it? And what are Iranian generals doing in general in Syria? Some people do not know what are the role of the Iranian advisors or generals in Syria. If you can clarify that.
I think it's pretty clear for your regular viewers, because I know you are very well acquainted with what is going on in Syria and what has been going on in Syria. So I won't give any detailed response, and because I'm sure they all know everything as well as I. But the Iranians have had a presence in Syria since Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. And they were there to help the Syrians and the Lebanese in the face of Israeli aggression. We all know that when the Israelis invaded Lebanon, they killed between 20 to 40,000 people. And in Sabra and Shatila, the Palestinian refugee camps, between 2,000 to 3,000 Palestinians and some Lebanese were massacred during that occupation. These camps are, of course, in the larger Beirut area today. So the Iranians went to support the resistance. A resistance gradually evolved out of this occupation. The most important resistance organization, of course, that was created was Hezbollah.
Yes.
And which gradually grew and became the symbol of resistance against the Israeli regime. Gradually, the Israelis had to withdraw. They moved back towards their borders in different phases. And ultimately, in the year 2000, they fully withdrew, although they kept certain small areas which the Lebanese consider to be theirs today. And so the Iranians have been assisting them, but also after the dirty war began in Syria in 2011, but really after 2013, when it began, when tens of thousands of foreign fighters began to come in, the Iranians had a more important role to play to help protect Syria. Contrary to what many people in the West like to think, and many supporters of the extremist groups in Syria like to believe, the Iranian involvement in Syria only began in the mid-2013. And the same is true with Hezbollah. Yes. And again, this was after tens of thousands of foreign fighters began to come in with Saudi money and funding from other regimes in the Persian Gulf, and with the support of Turkey, and to a lesser degree Jordan, and of course Israel,
Yes.
alongside the occupied Golan Heights. Both ISIS and Al-Qaeda they had taken territory. They were protected by the Israeli regime against the Syrian government. Whenever the Syrian government would try to take back that territory, the Israeli regime would use artillery, sometimes airstrikes, to defend these ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And of course, they would treat their injured in their hospitals. So the Iranians, their presence in Syria was basically to support the Lebanese expel the Israelis, and to help later on, when the Israelis again in 2006 invaded the country, to support them again in that invasion, and to help the Syrian people defend their country against Al-Qaeda
Yes.
and ISIS extremists and their allies.
Seyed Marandi, this is nowadays is highly appreciated in Syria. I think if you go to Damascus, to Homs, to Aleppo, in every corner, in Deir ez-Zor, in every corner, in every city, in every town, everybody knows that whether Iranian advisors or because of the Iranian support, the Syrian army and the allied forces were able to expel these the multinational terrorists, let's say, in most of the areas that they used to occupy between 2013 and 2018. This is something that nobody can argue against. However, some of the people nowadays are asking a question. Today I was reading for a former officer in the Syrian army. He is now retired. He wrote on his Facebook page, and he was thanking Iran for the role that they played during this mayhem that the CIA imposed on Syria, right? Because he was one of the generals in the suburbs of Damascus. He participated in the hostilities, so he knows what happened there. However, he also says that after the assassination of the Iranian brigadier general in Damascus, if Iran doesn't want to fight Israel directly, why is it receiving hits from Israel on Syrian soil? He said, I quote, "The endless preparations for war are an absurd situation, especially after October 7. He says, I call for rethinking of the Iranian strategy in Syria. What do you say to such criticism that is coming from an ally, asking, for example, for rethinking? What's the strategy here? When are we going to fight against Israel if this is going to be just an endless preparation for war?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I think the answer is will be a bit long, and I hope your viewers don't get too bored. First of all, Iran's presence in Syria is with the consent of the Syrian government. Yes. Iran will only be in Syria as long as they want the Syrians to be there. Yes. If the president of Syria decides otherwise, then the Iranian presence would not exist. Iran is not like Turkey, which is illegally occupying parts of Syria. It's not like the United States, which illegally occupies other parts of Syria. And it's not like Western countries and some countries in the region that are funding extremists or have special forces coming and going in Syria and causing harm to the country. I would also add that many of the airstrikes that the Israeli regime carries out against Syria, even though they say they are targeting Iranians, usually that's nonsense. Whenever an Iranian is martyred in Syria, the news comes out immediately. And just like in the recent case where this brigadier general was martyred. So the Israelis often strike at Syrian Arab army positions to weaken the government, to hurt the government, but they claim that they're striking Iranian targets to sort of justify this, even though it's not justifiable because these are violations of international law, it's murder, But in case they try to use the name of Iran to help the Western media create a narrative as if the Israelis are doing something that's justified. So not many targets, not many Iranians have been targeted. Sometimes in, let's say, places where artillery shells are stored or attacked, but usually they are very careful not to hit Iranians or Hezbollah or anyone affiliated to the Iranians. So most of the attacks are directed against the Syrian Arab Army. Another point that I should mention is that I don't think any of us really appreciate what is going on. And the people who are in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, a lot of their capabilities, a lot of the infrastructure that they've created is unknown to us. We've only learned about a bit about what is going on under Gaza after the battles began between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the resistance against the Israeli regime in Gaza. Now we all know that there's a lot going on under Gaza, very extensive and elaborate defense capabilities have been created, which have so far defeated the Israeli regime. And every time they lose on the battlefield around Gaza, in Gaza, in the northern areas, the southern areas, the central areas, they seek revenge on the civilian population and they carry out atrocities. So when they lose 10 soldiers in one area, they get angry and they bomb civilian targets, killing 100 or 200 at a time in revenge. We all know that they're not hitting Hamas. We know that they're not hitting Islamic Jihad. They never were. They are all deep underground. Their hospitals, their command centers, their factories, all of them are very deep underground, and the Israelis have had no success in dealing with this. So one can conclude that whatever we see today in Gaza, much better facilities have been created in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Iraq, simply because these countries are not surrounded like Gaza. It took many years, I'm certain, and a lot of hard work to develop the defenses and the military capabilities in and around Gaza. And if we look at Yemen today, if we look at Syria and Lebanon, I think there are many unknowns which will remain unknown until the time comes when the Israeli regime or an ally of the Israeli regime makes a foolish move.
Yeah, so the strategy here is one, deterrence, and two is retaliation if an attack happens against Iran or the allies of Iran. So the presence, if from what I understood from you, is to deter any sort of adventure from the Israeli side against the neighboring countries. And we can see nowadays that in Lebanon, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the liberation in 2000, the year 2000 of Lebanon. And Lebanon was just an open space for Israel to walk, let's say, in the south and go to the Litani River. It's like a picnic for them, right? And nowadays, Israel wants to establish rules of engagement with Hezbollah on a position that I hit you specifically here, you hit me specifically here. I don't want to escalate this. I don't want to expand this because the intervention of ground offensive, I would say, of Hezbollah is a game changer. And this is what I argued many times, that people who haven't followed the growth of Hezbollah since 2006, and they haven't seen their military capacity, experience, and the professionalism in the Syrian case, they don't know what Hezbollah is at the current moment. Therefore, there has been a deterrence established there. In Syria, it's a different matter. They have a different strategy. I'm not here to explain this strategy, but they call it in Syria the long run or the long breaths, they say, strategy. They call it like the 0 hour. When the 0 hour comes, they know how to retaliate against Israel. However, for the people who are asking me this question, I just want to give a very brief explanation why Syria isn't retaliating right now. Syria, people have to know that in the north, you have Turkish occupation forces, you have American occupation forces in the south, in the east, you have the largest safe haven for Al-Qaeda terrorists in the world, according to the Pentagon in Syria. And I suspect if Syria engages directly with Israel, all these elements will move inside Syria. So those are the fifth columns inside Syria that they will move against the Syrian army again to capture territories like they did in 2014 and 13 and 16. I would like to ask you.
And I would like to just add
please.
One point here to what you say, and that is another reason why the Iranians continue with their presence in Syria. Because if the Israeli regime carries out some sort of assault on Syria, or if the Americans choose to escalate, or if Turkey chooses to escalate through its Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda allies in Idlib and those regions, then the Syrian army needs the support of its allies to make sure that it does not face a dangerous situation. So part of the presence, I think, is because of its traditional role. Part of it is to help protect the Syrians in case of some sort of adventurism. But part of it, I think, is not going to be known by us for the time being. In the past, the Israelis have assaulted Gaza many times and killed many people. And as we all know, the war did not begin on October the 7th. October the 7th was a response to all those atrocities. But in any case, ever since October the 7th began, we've discovered the capabilities of Hamas and its allies. But from the very beginning, Ayatollah Khamenei, when he spoke about the war, he was optimistic and he expressed strong optimism about the strength of the resistance in Gaza. And I think at that time, it was not clear to the rest of us how that resistance would hold its territory, how it would stand up against this aggression. So obviously he knew a lot more about the capabilities under Gaza than most of the rest of us. So I think we should keep this in mind when we're thinking about the capabilities in Syria of the resistance, meaning the broader resistance, the Syrian army, Iran, its allies, in Lebanon, as well in Yemen, the Saudis with Canadian, German, French, British, US help bombed the country day and night for 7 years, using hundreds of billions of dollars to do so. Ultimately, the Saudis had to accept a ceasefire because the Yemeni armed forces were becoming so powerful that all of the Saudi oil installations were at risk. So ever since the ceasefire, I'm sure that they've done much more to develop their defense capabilities in Yemen. So again, what I'm saying is that there are many things that we don't know, and hopefully we won't need to know about those capabilities in the future, and the Israeli regime will melt away. But if there is escalation in Syria, I'm sure you'll find out, we'll all find out, that there is much more in Syria. There are greater capabilities for the defense of Syria that the Israelis believe at the moment exist.
Seyed Marandi, there is a personality in the United States that since I am a child, I remember him very well, the mustache guy called John Bolton. And And I used to see him like a bulldog when I was a child, a long time ago, when he was the ambassador of the US, or the permanent envoy to the UN. And then he became also an official under Donald Trump. And now I don't know, maybe he is jobless, maybe he retired, maybe he's just writing some articles here and there. And recently he published a new article. He says the West may now have no option but to attack Iran. I just want to quote few sentences from his recent article. He said, the Pentagon said on December 23rd that an Iranian-launched drone struck an Israeli-affiliated merchant ship in the Indian Ocean. This marks the first time since October 7 that Washington has directly blamed Iran, even with over 100 attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by Iran-dependent Shia militias, on which the White House has fudged in assigning responsibility. Then he says the critical truth here is that Iran has directly committed an act of war against what it believed was an Israeli target. Both Houthi and Shia militia attacks have been met with only feeble and ineffective Western responses. Neither Hamas nor Houthis nor Iraqi militia have yet prompted the US or Israel to retaliate directly against Iran. Obviously, Iran doesn't feel pressured enough to restrain its expendable surrogates, proving that the West has not established conditions for deterrence, thereby potentially cooling the conflict down. And finally, he said, only if Israel, America, Britain, and others show they possess the resolve and capability to impose significant costs on Iran as punishment for its aggression, will they persuade the Ayatollahs that proceeding further will bring them intolerable pain. Very likely only direct military force applied against critical targets inside Iran will impose such costs, proving to Tehran it has miscalculated not only about Israel, but on President Biden and the West more general. I see that you're smiling on the other side in Tehran. But doesn't it bother you, or does Tehran take precautions and take such, let's say, threats seriously? I mean, I know Bolton doesn't have an influence nowadays on the decision making, but he's a neocon and he still has his circles and listening to them, and probably he's speaking their mind, right?
There are two things really that come to mind. One is that Bolton and people like Bolton have been saying the same thing about Iran for a very long time. This is nothing new. And the reason why the United States never attacked Iran directly, even 2 decades ago, or 1 decade ago, when Iran was weaker than it is today, and the US was stronger than it is today, was because a war with Iran is not a winnable war. It would create massive destruction in Iran. It would create massive destruction across the Persian Gulf region. It would create a global economic crisis, and the Americans would lose the war. No one would win, but the Americans would definitely lose. So there was a sort of balance of terror. The Iranians said that any country that helps the US would be an aggressor. So those countries that have US bases right now in the region, they would be seen as hostile. Today, Iran is much stronger than it was back then. And if we go back to what I said earlier about the capabilities in Syria, the capabilities in Gaza, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, imagine what sort of capabilities exist in Iran.
Yes.
The drone capabilities, the missile capabilities. If there was an attack on Iran, the retaliation would be extraordinarily harsh, and that would create a global economic crisis. So the Americans are not foolish enough to do this. It's highly unlikely that they would attack Iran, even though they are desperate to help the Israeli regime. The problem that the Americans are facing right now is that the longer this war lasts, the weaker the Israeli regime becomes, the weaker the United States becomes, the weaker the collective West becomes, because the whole global South is turning against all of them. And even public opinion in Europe and North America significant segments of them are viewing the conflict in Palestine in a different way than they viewed it ever before.
Yes.
Especially in the United States, which is extraordinarily pro-Israeli. And the voices that support Palestine have always been marginalized. They continue to be systematically marginalized, but things are changing very fast. So the West has lost its credibility across in the world. It can no longer speak about human rights and human values and freedom of speech. Well over 100 journalists have been murdered in Gaza, many of them with their families. In other words, they were targeted assassinations, wiping out whole families, extended families. All of this was to silence the Palestinians, and the Western media, they played their part in the silencing of Palestinian voices. If a single journalist was, let's say, killed in Iran, or in Syria, or in Venezuela, or in Cuba, there would be uproar across the European Union and in Canada and the United States. There would be sanctions after sanctions imposed upon these countries. There would be awards given to their colleagues and their families, and elaborate gatherings of people and protests in capitals across Europe. But we see the whole of the Palestinian journalistic society wiped out by the Israeli regime, and nothing happens. Complete silence, no protests, no sanctions. So the West has destroyed its credibility, and it wants this war to end. But at the same time, there is a sort of there's forces dragging them into directions. They cannot stand up against the forces that want to continue the war within the United States, within Europe, and within Israel itself. Of course, in Israel, the overwhelming majority wants the genocide to continue according to their own polls.
Yes.
But the forces, very powerful forces in the United States that are highly influential, want the United States to abide by the wishes of the Israeli people to continue with the genocide. So on the one hand, the Americans want the war to stop. The Europeans, I'm sure, want the war to stop because they see that they're being their credibility is being demolished across the world. But on the other hand, they are forced to support Israel. So when in Yemen, Ansar Allah comes out and blocks Israeli shipping, instead of putting pressure on Israel to stop the genocide, the Americans become angry and they try to confront the Yemeni armed forces. The article by Bolton, or statements made by US senators and others about the necessity to strike Iran is basically because these are linked to those powerful forces in the United States that want the genocide to continue unimpeded.
Yes.
So they are actually the enemies of the United States. They are the enemies of the European Union. They are the enemies of Canada, because they are sacrificing, morality aside, this is genocide. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter where in the world it takes place. This is genocide. This is a horrific, this is probably the worst act of genocide in human history, simply because it's being carried out in front of our eyes. We are witnessing it. We've had more people die during other wars, but this is the first time that people are seeing it as it happens. And then while people are being slaughtered, we see Western leaders saying, no ceasefire, Hamas must be destroyed. Or we see Israeli fanatics, and I'm talking about mainstream politicians, go on television every night and say we have to wipe out the whole of Gaza, and there's no condemnation in the West. None. Imagine if the Syrian president said we must wipe out this segment of society, or if the Venezuelan president said this, or the Cuban president, what the reaction would be in the West. So these people are destroying the United States. They are destroying the EU. They are destroying the West. But because they are pawns of the military-industrial complex and the Zionist lobby, they will push for this sort of confrontation or escalation, but they would fail. The American military knows that those forces, the power that Iran has, and those forces across the region that are allied to Iran, that they can make life miserable for the United States. And one final point that I should add, and that is that Bolton, in what you read, shows that Bolton and not just the neocons in the United States, in the West, there's a false understanding of the nature of Iran's relationship with other members of this resistance movement or the resistance movements, and that is that they are not proxies. Yemen, the Yemeni armed forces, Ansarullah, they are not Iranian proxies. Hezbollah is not an Iranian proxy. The Syrian government is not an Iranian proxy. These are allies. And when the United States imposed maximum pressure against Iran, both under Obama and Trump, especially under Trump, they thought that now that they will deprive Iran of much of its oil exports, that its allies in the region would collapse. Why? Because that's how proxies work. They're mercenaries. You pay them, they do work for you. Just like the proxies that the Americans and countries in the Persian Gulf and Mr. Erdogan and others and the Israelis had in Syria. Those were proxies. Well, most of them. Many of them were also fanatics. But the Free Syrian Army, they were all just proxies. They were making money. They were the shop owners. They were giving the weapons to the extremists. They would get the weapons from the West, from Turkey, and then they would hand them out, distribute them to the different fanatical organizations that were effectively doing the bidding of the West.
Yeah.
But in any case, when Iranian oil exports went down, we saw that in Yemen, the resistance grew. We saw in Gaza, the resistance grew so powerful that we see how it's defeating the Israeli regime on the battlefield. We see how Hezbollah has grown. We see how the Syrian army has been able to stabilize the country through their own heroics, but also the support that the Iranians and others and the Russians gave to them. So as long as they continue to believe that these are proxies, they are going to miscalculate because they're going to underestimate their potential adversaries. But the smart thing for them to do is to recognize that the people of Yemen have agency, that the people of Lebanon have agency. They make their decisions. And their decision is to support the people of Gaza, just like it is the decision of the Iranians to support the people of Gaza. And Iran continues to support the people of Gaza as we speak. As we speak. You may ask how, but there are many things that we will know in the future that we don't know today.
Seyed Mohammad Marandi, I agree with you completely about the United States is losing credibility, also the Europeans, not only credibility, but respect, especially in the global south, in West Asia. And people are disgusted, I would say, by the insistence of the Americans and the Europeans for this onslaught to continue in the Gaza Strip. And I can see the mood here in Berlin, especially among the younger generation, has shifted radically against Israel in a country that is taboo to speak against Israel. Here in Germany, you cannot criticize Israel. In the United States, they are the biggest supporter of Israel. And despite that, because of social media and because of the people sending footage and images on these platforms, we can see what's happening. I mean, you cannot hide the sunshine forever. You may try, but you cannot hide it forever, right? Therefore, as much as they try, in my opinion, to control the narrative, they will fail. And in the era of TikTok and all this younger generation, they impress me in the way that they're delivering the message of the people in Palestine here in the Western societies, and they are influencing the public opinion. And on the other hand, I would call the traditional media, they have become like a dinosaur. They're dying. and they will extinct soon. And the news that we can see on X now, you will see tomorrow on the mainstream media here in Germany, and they are still peddling the same thing of the October 7 attacks and how Israel has the right to defend itself and everything. People are sick and tired of that. I can agree with you on this. Now, I want to end up this with Jeffrey Sachs, because Jeffrey Sachs has a new video and he says the United States stands alone with Israel nowadays, and they're isolated from around the world because of this policy in the Gaza Strip. But if I was an American, if you were an American decision maker now in the Biden administration, so from the American perspective, what other policy option does Washington have except siding with Israel, right?
Well, they have many options. The problem is that they've chosen a particular option, and that is that they are willing to sacrifice their own credibility and their own moral authority, which they never had, but this facade of moral authority for the sake of Israel. But it's not just about Israel. You know this as well as I, that this began a long time ago, but it gradually began to weaken the United States, or let's say it began to weaken the United States more rapidly after 9/11 and the endless wars. The United States, I think that two things happened that really harmed the United States. One was their victory over Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and the other was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think these really harmed the United States. Why? Because they gave this false sense, created this false sense among many Americans that they are what Madeleine Albright called I forget the term, but in any case, this sense of exceptionalism,
exceptionalism,
the sense of exceptionalism in the United States was strengthened, and they felt that the United States was the essential country. That without the United States, the world really doesn't work, and they felt that they can do anything to anyone. This was the end of history, even though Fukuyama said this, and then later on he sort of pulled back. But still, this sense is strong in the West that somehow they are morally superior, they are more capable, they are more rational, they are destined to defeat any potential adversary. So the United States, based upon this notion, overextended itself. It created crises for itself in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, but I think perhaps the most important was in Ukraine. From the very beginning, it was clear to us that they would lose in Ukraine. We've been saying this all along, that this is an unwinnable war. But the Americans sacrificed so much of the wealth of their own taxpayers, and of course the lives of the people of Ukraine and Russians, because they wanted to expand their influence. Even though they were as someone once called it, the hyperpower, it wasn't enough. It's never enough. They always wanted more and more. So they overextended themselves. And we are reaching a stage, in my opinion, where the United States and the empire is collapsing. It is literally collapsing before our eyes. And what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza simultaneously, even though these are two different theaters and they have two different histories, together they are wrecking the United States and Europe economically, militarily, for a host of other reasons. It's being shown to the world that their weapons are not all that great. We see how in Gaza they are destroying tanks one after another with weapons that are very inexpensive. And of course in Ukraine we see Western weaponry being destroyed by the Russian army. And then, of course, as I said earlier, this facade of human rights and human values and all that. So this indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright
I was
called
going
it,
to tell you, yes,
yes,
indispensable
this
nation.
indispensable nation is not so indispensable. But what they've done as a result of this policy is that they've weakened themselves, and we see that the crises developing inside the United States,
Yes,
to a large degree because of this. If the Americans, instead of wasting trillions of dollars on war and building bases across the world, if they had just protected their borders, protected their workers, created greater infrastructure, you would see a United States of America.
yeah,
But they spent the last few decades, and in particular the last 22, 23 years, on destroying all that which they had, because they created an image of themselves of, power, overwhelming power and capability that was not real or realistic.
yeah. They haven't learned, I think, from history that overexpansion. There are so many examples of empires that overexpanded and collapsed because of the costs of the preserving the empire. Nowadays, they have over 800 bases around the world. They're spending almost $1 trillion per year over the military. They're printing hell of a money to sustain that, and that creates inflation. In the United States, which is theft, in my opinion. It's an undeclared taxation of the people. They're taking the money from the pockets of the people to finance these wars around the world, and the people are becoming more dependent, I would argue, to the government.
Yes, the United States, its strength was always founded upon a strong middle class.
Yeah.
And because of these policies, both because of neoliberalism, but also because of these never-ending wars, we see the middle class collapsing.
Yeah.
And the United States is becoming like many of those countries where you have a majority of poor people and a minority of rich people.
Yes.
And that is a recipe for instability and for many of the things that we've been seeing over the past few years in the United States.
Yeah, I think the circle of the empires is already, we are in the last 2 or 3 stages for the United States. The good news would be if the United States accepts that they should be a multipolar world and participate in this multipolar world as a normal nation instead of being a bully around the world. Because if the United States collapses, there will be also huge economic ramifications and repercussions on the rest of the world. We do not want.
I believe that we are heading for a major global economic crisis, largely for these reasons.
Yeah, I'm totally on your side. Therefore, the rational thing and a reasonable thing to do is to accept this arrogance that these elites have in the United States, not accepting the fact that the life is a circle. So they could save all the monetary power they have now and take a break from international politics for a decade or 2, regain their potentials and come back as a superpower again, like try to dominate again. But what they're doing is in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Syria, everybody now understands that the US is an empire. And the moment the United States loses its respect and reputation as a respectable power in the eyes of the people, people start rising against this dominant power, because the people see the injustice inflicted. In the past 2 decades, maybe they were hiding it. And now in the era of social media, it has become very, very difficult for them to control the narrative. And therefore, we have new regulations by the EU, by the American governments trying to censor speech. They're trying to censor what you can write and say on social media platforms. And they will come after these social media platforms and try to regulate it. They will try to regulate it to protect us for our own safety from dangerous thoughts, so.
From people like yourself.
Yeah, brace yourself, guys, for dangerous people like myself. Dr. Mohammad Marandi, I'm very grateful for you to dedicating time for me and for the audience of Syriana Analysis. Thank you very much. I wish you a happy new year. I wish you peace and also prosperity for the Iranian people. And I hope 2024 we would see a ceasefire in Gaza, a sustainable and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We would see a nationhood for the Palestinians and a dignified life for them. And I don't think there is a better thing to wish and work for. We can say words, but I think everybody has to do what they can, whether verbally or physically, try to help the people in Palestine and try to bring the voices of the Palestinian people and try to educate the people and tell them that in this era, it's impossible for us to watch what's happening in the Gaza Strip and stay silent about it. And whoever is staying silent about it, in my opinion, is now a complicit with the atrocities against the Palestinians. Or I don't know if people are completely detached from the reality, but most of the people are speaking, but I think we have to do more. If you have a voice, guys, try to tell your family members, speak to them, even if it's Christmas, even if it's New Year. Do it like myself. The moment you sit on the table with the family, just drop the bomb of the political speech and see how it works.
Absolutely. And I too encourage everyone to be more active and to boycott anything that helps the Israeli regime. And although I can't say speak of a Merry Christmas, because it's been a painful 2.5 months, but I hope that those who celebrated Christmas over the past few days, that they have a good year ahead of them. And for those like yourself who celebrate Christmas next week, I wish all of our Christian friends who celebrate in January a happy Christmas. Again, not a Merry Christmas. It's too painful, the current circumstances, for anyone to be merry, but I hope they have a safe Christmas, a happy Christmas. And I hope all Christians, Muslims, Jews, and everyone else, and I don't consider Zionists to be Jews, or Christians who are Zionists to be real Christians, but all Christians, Muslim, Jews, and everyone else to have a safe year ahead of them. The Iranian calendar is a bit different. Our year starts on the first day of spring.
Yes.
So we have a different calendar, but for everyone else, I hope they all have a very good year, and I hope we have peace for the people of Palestine and an end to racism and apartheid across the whole of Palestine, in Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and everywhere else.
Inshallah, I truly wish that these wishes come true in 2024. Thank you very much, Dr. Seyed Mohammad Marandi, for your time.